Now that we've discussed the steps to planning, let's talk a little bit about the skills necessary to be a good strategist and a good planner. We like to make the analogy of being a good marketing strategist and a general. So we refer to this, of course, as the marketing general. The strategist must have an intimate knowledge of what happens on the battlefield. You cannot be a good strategist unless you know what is going on in your industry. You need to know what's going on with your competition, you need to know what's going on with your customers, and you need to know what's going on in the macro environment. As Patton, famous George Patton, famous World War II general, quotes, "One tries to make plans fit the circumstances." The key to being a great strategist, then, is the ability to do good planning. The general or the head coach or the strategist must be flexible. Turns out that many strategists start with a strategy that's worked for them in the past, and then they analyze the situation, and lo and behold, they make the situation fit the strategy that they wanted to use. And the facts are never clear cut, and so they decide, let's do what we did last time. It turns out that being flexible and being willing to make changes is one of the things that is a true virtue. Mental courage. We have this little saying that says, when you're up to your ears in alligators, it's difficult to remember that the objective was to drain the swamp. In many cases, decisions that we have made do not appear to be working. There is a point in time when you have to have the courage to make changes or to stay with decisions that you've made in the past. Once again, it is this mental toughness and this mental courage that makes good strategists. Boldness is a key for being a good strategist. Decisiveness is a key trait. You have to know when to hold them, and of course, you have to know when it's time to make a change. You need to know the facts. The realities and details are critical. Do not try to make the facts fit the situation and the strategy that you want to implement. When you see the facts, analyze them. Understand the facts. As Joe Friday used to say on Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Lucky. This is sort of an interesting part of being a good strategist. You have to realize that when you're on a roll, you need to let it ride. And of course, you also need to know when to fold them and take your winnings. You need to understand the idea of being lucky. Communication skills. As we like to say, motivation will not win the battle, but low morale can certainly defeat any strategy. Your marketing team will be successful if they are motivated. But if they are not motivated and discouraged, almost for certain, the implementation will not be successful. Of course, integrity. Integrity and trust bonds a team together. One of the ways that you build a winning team is to make sure that everyone knows that we are working together, we're all on the same team, and we have each other's backs. And of course, there is this notion of creativity. That is the ability to see new solutions for old problems. As Einstein used to say, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. An example, Lou Holtz's accomplishments at William and Mary, North Carolina State, Arkansas, Minnesota, Notre Dame are very impressive. In each of those stops as him as a head coach. Now, Lou Holtz is a very famous football coach who is now retired and is mostly known for his successes at Arkansas and Notre Dame. But it turns out that one of his biggest successes was at Minnesota. He took a job at Minnesota, and Minnesota had a one-win season before he got there. He got to Minnesota and he looked around, and it turned out that he did not have a very talented football team. But he did find out that the best athlete on his team was a second or third string quarterback by the name of Ricky Foggy. So while Lou Holtz was never an option coach, he implemented the triple option with Ricky Foggy at the quarterback. And they rode Ricky Foggy to an 8-4 season and a bowl game. And Lou Holtz won that turnaround at Minnesota to the job at Notre Dame, the job that he had always coveted. His success at Minnesota wasn't based on doing the same old thing that Lou always did, but instead learning how to adapt to the situation as it was presented to him. All right, next let's talk about Dwight David Eisenhower and Operation Overlord. As most of you know, Eisenhower was tasked with planning and executing the D-Day invasion of Europe in World War II. Let's go back and take a look at exactly what had happened. The United States had entered World War II right after Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. 2.5 years later, all of the Allied forces had been driven off of the continent of Europe and were all located in Britain. So now the plan was, the idea was to create a plan to re-invade Europe and eventually try to win the war against Germany and Italy. So Eisenhower is sitting in Britain. They are trying to figure out how to successfully invade Europe. And all he has to do is come up with a plan to successfully do that. Of course, Europe is controlled by Germany. Germany knows where the Allied troops are. They're all located in Britain, 30 miles away from the shores of northern Europe in France. And it seems relatively obvious in terms of where the invasion is going to take place, roughly when the invasion has to take place, and how the invasion is going to take place. So all Eisenhower has to do is come up with a plan to somehow create an element of surprise, successfully invade Europe with the Allied troops, and drive the Germans back to their home country of Germany. This is undoubtedly one of the most difficult and monumental planning activities that ever took place. The Germans know what the Allied forces are going to do. The Allied forces know what they are going to do. And everyone is sure as to how this is going to take place. Yet Eisenhower, and of course remember that we had a famous Eisenhower quote, and the Eisenhower quote was, "Plans are nothing, planning is everything." Went through the process of planning and planning and planning down to the very last detail, as to how this invasion would take place. And finally, on June 6th, 1944, the Allied troops invaded France in Northern Europe, almost exactly where the Germans had suspected they would. But because Eisenhower had created a very clever, unique plan along with his other generals, the invasion, while there was a large loss of life, was successful. And within a year of that invasion of northern France, the Allied forces had won a victory in Europe, and Germany had surrendered. And of course, Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. This is undoubtedly one of the great planning and strategy examples of all of military history. Now, for my third example, I'm going to give you something that's maybe a little bit closer to home, maybe a little bit more business oriented. It's the story of Lee Iacocca. Now, Lee Iacocca was an engineer who had worked his way up at Ford Motor Company. Started at Ford Motor Company in the late 40s, and by the early 60s, Ford was in trouble. Ford had lost a lot of its market share to General Motors and specifically to Chevrolet. There was a little motto that was generated in the early 60s, and that is, Ford is selling safety and Chevrolet is selling cars. And so Ford was in big trouble. And the Ford Motor Company turned to Iacocca and his planning group of engineers to come up with a new car to get Ford back in the automotive business and gain market share back from General Motors. Ford was coming off a number of unsuccessful new models, including the famous Edsel, which is known as one of the biggest failures in all of the car industry, and a number of other activities that really didn't go very well for Ford. So Iacocca and his people came up with the Ford Mustang. Easily the most successful American automobile ever produced. They came out with this car in mid-1964. It was a 1965 model year. But Iacocca and his people turned Ford around with the Ford Mustang. They grabbed a bunch of market share. They got to where they were selling 800 to 1 million Mustangs per year. And Iacocca is largely credited with saving Ford from potential bankruptcy. And of course, he thought he would be the next president at Ford because of his success. And in the late 70s, they finally made Iacocca the president at Ford, but then after a year or so decided to fire him. So after 32 years at Ford, Iacocca was suddenly unemployed, and having been credited with Ford's biggest success since the Model T. Well, right about that time, Chrysler was being forced into bankruptcy because no one was interested in buying the Chrysler Corporation's cars. At that point in time, Chrysler was made up of Chryslers, Dodge, and Plymouths. They were making cars that were named the Cordoba and the Fury 1, 2, and 3, and a number of other automobiles that were just not very successful for Chrysler. Now, Chrysler had a fairly successful 1960s with their particular set of performance cars, which included the Dodge Charger and the Plymouth Barracudas and and some of the Chrysler automobiles that were more high performance automobiles. But in the late 60s and into the 70s, the price of automobile fuel had doubled, and Chrysler cars were thought of as big gas guzzling automobiles. And the Japanese automobile companies had come in particular Datsun, which is now Nissan, and Honda, had come in and grabbed a large share of the small U.S. car market. So Chrysler hired Iacocca. Iacocca took a salary of $1 per year and said, when I turn Chrysler around, you can go ahead and pay me what you think I'm worth. So Iacocca takes over control at Chrysler. Chrysler was doing bad. They had gotten down to where they were almost out of cash. They got a bailout contract from the government. But it was only really going to be good for 3 or 4 months or 5 months. And so Lee Iacocca and his team came up with an automobile to save Chrysler. And that automobile was introduced in 1979, and it was a series of K cars. Now, the K cars included the Plymouth Reliant, the Plymouth and Dodge Reliant, the Aries, and a number of other cars that all came under the K family brand name. And the idea behind the K car was that Iacocca and his engineers had gone out and done a bunch of research. And when they asked customers, what kind of a car should Chrysler make for you to buy, they all said that there were 4 things that they wanted in cars in 1979. And those 4 things were, first off, a fuel-efficient automobile with good miles per gallon. And that, of course, was because the price of fuel had doubled at that point in time from 30 cents a gallon to 60 cents a gallon. While that number doesn't seem high today, in the 70s, it really sent ripples through the automobile business. They wanted front-wheel drive automobiles because they had seen front-wheel drive automobiles in the Japanese imports. But one of the things they disliked about the Japanese imports was that the cars were particularly small. And so they wanted that car to be 5 passengers. And then, of course, finally, with the new Japanese cars coming into the U.S., they were very reliable automobiles. So they wanted cars that were also reliable. So the 4 things were good miles per gallon, front-wheel drive, 5 passengers, reliable automobiles. So they went, Iacocca and his engineers got into their offices and their planning, and they developed something called the K car. And the K car was a 4-cylinder, fuel-efficient, front-wheel drive, 5-passenger automobile. So they started making them, and they were making them like crazy. And Iacocca was sure that, like the Mustang at Ford, the K car would turn Chrysler around. Well, after a few months, Lee Iacocca came to work one day, and he rolled up the window, the blinds of the windows in his office, and he looked out into the plant area, and all you could see were K cars. And so Lee immediately called a meeting of all of the engineers in a great big hall at Chrysler and said, what's going on? How come we're not selling any of these cars? And they said, well, Lee, customers just don't want to buy them. And Lee said, what do you mean? We did all the research. These are fuel-efficient, front-wheel drive, 5-passenger, reliable automobiles. So, so Lee was on stage, and finally one of the engineers in the front row raised his hand and said, "Lee, the problem is people don't think that cars made by Chrysler are reliable." So Lee said, "All right." He said, "Let me think about that." So the next day he called another meeting with all of the people, and he said, "I've got the solution." He said the solution will be 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty on these cars. Now, at that point in time, most cars had a 1-year, 12,000-mile warranty on them. That is, the cars were warranted for 1 year. Lee was proposing that he increase that 5-fold. And he said that will signal to the customer that we have reliable automobiles and they have nothing to worry about. Well, engineer in the front row raised his hand again, and he stood up and he said, "Lee," he said, "we're concerned because we're not sure these cars will go 5 years or 50,000 miles without breaking down." Lee's response was, "It doesn't matter, because if we don't sell any of these, we'll go out of business anyway." And so they put the 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty, making a small tweak to the K cars, and they started to sell like crazy. And they turned Chrysler around. They paid back their loan that they'd gotten from the government, the bailout loan they'd gotten from the government, and Chrysler was successful. So Lee then stepped down. 4 years later, Chrysler's back talking to Lee Iacocca, trying to convince him to come back because the Chrysler Corporation is once again in trouble and on the verge of bankruptcy. Lee said, "Didn't I just fix Chrysler?" They said, "Yeah, but the market's changed, Lee. And now people aren't interested in K cars anymore." So Lee came back to Chrysler, sat down with his engineers, and he brought something to market that was a project that he had started long ago at Ford, but was ripe for this particular market. And this is when Chrysler introduced the minivan. And it, of course, was a huge success and saved Chrysler again. So here is a man, Lee Iacocca, that in 3 separate occasions helped bring 2 different car companies away from the brink of bankruptcy. And in each case, the automobile that he brought to market was the right automobile for that particular point in time. So when he came to Chrysler, he didn't try to recreate the Mustang at Chrysler. He, at Chrysler, developed an automobile that was right for the particular time at Chrysler. And in 1984, when they introduced the minivan, it was once again the right vehicle for the right time. So this demonstrates Lee Iacocca's ability to evaluate the situation and come up with the best possible solution for the given situation. And of course, this is one of the reasons that Lee Iacocca is always considered to be one of the great automobile strategists and one of the great automobile minds. Great strategists are those that can adapt to the situation at hand. The worst competitive strategists and the worst marketing strategy people are those with no creativity. They only have one option: imitate someone else. They're easy to identify. They use terms like benchmarking, proven strategies, best practices, modeling, emulating. They're always modeling someone else's strategy, no matter how inappropriate given the situation. If that sounds familiar, then you're in an organization without great strategists.